I think to ensure that we're able to get through all of the information we have, we will get started. Welcome, everyone. This is the Food Safety Liability Basics webinar. We've invited Rachel Armstrong from Farm Commons to present this webinar in partnership with FARRMS. And it's June, farmers markets are starting soon. And we thought this was a great time for everyone to have access to a refresher course on how you can market food safely and handle food safely when you are vending at farmers market, farming, when you operate a CSA, all those times when you're handling food that is being marketed to the public. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Rachel Armstrong, and the floor is yours, Rachel.
All right. Hey, folks. I hope you are having a good day. I'm gonna share my presentation. So I take over your screen for a moment, and there we go. Food Safety Liability Basics. I'm with Farm Commons. Let me tell you a little bit more about my organization in case you aren't familiar. So our mission is to empower agricultural communities to address their own legal vulnerabilities within an ecosystem of support. So what that looks like on a day-to-day basis is webinars, just like this one. Also guides, we write long guides, short guides, we write model documents, all kinds of good things at our website. We also host workshops around the country on farm law issues. We have a podcast, and we do question and answer on our platforms. We are staffed by attorneys and skilled educators. So this is what we do all day long, is teach folks. We also do leadership development. We might be attorneys, but we know that we really don't have the answers to what is going to work on farms and by farmers. So we work closely with farmers themselves to help develop and elevate community-led solutions to legal challenges and complications. We're a membership-based organization. I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. But another reason I want to tell you we're driven by membership is because I want you to know that we are not driven by legal fees. We might be attorneys again, but you can't hire us to handle your legal matter. Not just because we aren't licensed in North Dakota, but because it's just not the way we achieve our mission. We believe and know that there is a lot that farmers can do themselves when they have access to the right information. An attorney is still important in many cases, but we want you to know we're not doing this so that you'll turn around and hire us at maybe large fees so that we can make money. This is all we do. My name is Rachel Armstrong. I am actually the founder of Farm Commons as well. I live in Duluth, Minnesota. This is where I grew up, where my family before me farmed. Nice little picture of there of what was a cabbage and potato operation long ago. You can see it's in a good cutover area, as so much of northern Minnesota was. You know, growing up in an agricultural community, farming is what I've always loved. And I went to law school in order to found Farm Commons. And I did that because I really believe that agricultural communities deserve this information so that folks can develop resilience that's consistent with their values and the way they want to run their business. So that's what brings me here. If you have a chance, I would love to learn a little bit more about you. I've delivered, I don't even know how many webinars, so I'm really skilled at looking at the chat box and my slides. So if you type your name and if you have a farm name into the chat box, I'd love to get a sense of who you are. The other reason I'm asking you to do that is because I love the chat box and your questions are really important to me as we go. Please make liberal use of it. If you don't understand something I'm saying, there's a question you want me to ask now or later, you just go ahead, go right in the chat box, type it out. I'll keep an eye on it. And if there's something, if you ask something I can answer while I'm going to do that. If I want to save it for the end, that works too. And actually, I didn't turn the subtitles on. Oh, so forget that last point. I try to remember, but all right. So that is the setup for who we are and how we all ended up here. But we're here today to talk food safety, so let's do it. And, I probably don't need to tell you this, but one of farmers' worst fears, of course, is that they get someone sick from the food that they are producing. Dangerous bacteria, very sneaky. Our most common culprits, you call them by the acronym SEL, S-E-L. The S is for salmonella, the E for E. coli, the L for listeria. These things pop up on the farm from time to time. You can have a nice piece of kale chopped for a side of slaw, and what do you know, it's got E. coli on it. Listeria is tricky as well. One of the things we see is it can make its way into caramel apples, that might be eaten on the farm. The origination of these bacteria can be difficult to pin down as well. We can look in a number of places, things like irrigation water, worker hygiene, our harvest and our packing equipment, wildlife visitors. All of these are possible vectors capable of transmitting these pathogens. But no matter how they end up on your farm, we of course want to avoid these things getting in our food, particularly food that we are selling to the public. And the risk isn't just theoretical, it's very real. The CDC estimates that each year 48 million people get sick from foodborne illnesses in the United States. You probably already know these classic cases, the cantaloupes. In 2011, 33 people died after eating listeria-tainted cantaloupe in Colorado. You might already know it was traced back to a farm owned by two brothers. And eventually, those folks pled guilty to misdemeanor counts of introducing adulterated food into interstate commerce. And they had to pay $150,000 in restitution and perform 100 hours of community service for that. So the cantaloupes, I think the cantaloupes eclipsed spinach. Spinach used to be the classic tale, and there's the peanut butter story too. But the point is, there's a lot of these stories. They have a big impact. They have, and they can cause financial devastation to the farmer at the end of the line. So food safety risks are real legal risks for farm businesses. When you're selling your farm products, raw or processed, that comes with the risk of people getting sick. And that includes the potential for fines and penalties that can threaten a farm's ability to thrive or survive. So I'm going to use the example of the cantaloupes and the folks who farm them as an example today. Now we've got those bad numbers, that huge fine and that community service, but is that an example that happens often? If you grow cantaloupe that ends up with listeria on it, are you liable for anything? For everything? Just because it's your cantaloupes? No, not necessarily. The situation is definitely more complex than that, and that's what we'll talk about today. There are some legal conditions when you could end up responsible simply because there is listeria on a cantaloupe that you sold. That does happen and did play a role in the two brothers case in Colorado, but it is less common. What is more common is that somebody like these two brothers would end up responsible for that listeria if they were negligent. Now, that's not the charge that the $150,000 and 100 hours of community service resulted from, but it is the more common and more likely scenario for your average run-of-the-mill farmer with a tainted food product. Now, by contrast, if a cantaloupe grower is not negligent, it is less likely that they will be liable for people getting sick. So negligence is a really important concept when it comes to, are you responsible for the bad things that happen? And I point that out because I want you to feel like you have some control over what is happening here. It's the legal system isn't quite as crazy as if there's listeria there, then you get a $150,000 fine. Not quite that crazy. There is different avenues by which you can end up responsible. Negligence is the most common one, and it is one that you have some control over. So we're going to dig a little deeper into the concept of negligence and how that applies for a little bit here. So let's say, upon hearing the cantaloupe story, you look at cantaloupe a little differently now. Maybe you don't grow it, but your neighbor does. And your neighbor is wondering, oh man, could this happen to me? Could I end up liable if somebody gets sick from my cantaloupe? As you know now, as I already told you, the basic answer is yes. If, assuming the farmer is a woman, if her actions were negligent. So now what I'm leading you towards is the definition of negligence. You know that must be very important. If that is the difference between you walking away scot-free and you having a huge fine or community service or even jail time, we've got to know what negligence is. In common usage, when we tend to say, oh, that guy's really negligent, we tend to mean something like they're careless, they don't pay attention, they don't seem to care about the welfare of others, those sorts of things. That's what, if we're just chit-chatting, that's what negligence tends to mean between us. But is that what the law considers to be negligent? No, that's probably where I'm going with this. No, it's not, because the law likes to make things a little bit more complicated. It likes to have its own definitions. So let's hear that. What is the legal definition of negligence? Okay, your average cantaloupe farmer, she is negligent if she acts less reasonably than the average farmer would have acted under similar circumstances. So again, from a legal perspective, negligence is not carelessness or disregard for others. It is not being a neglectful person. Negligence is the failure to do what the average person would have done under those circumstances. So our cantaloupe farmer would be considered negligent if her actions in the growing, irrigating, harvesting, handling, and packing the cantaloupe were outside the norm. If they were less than what the average farmer would have done, the average farmer in her area who grows cantaloupe. And, assuming there's like 2 other people, we could broaden that a little bit. Other people who grow fresh market specialty crops, other people who grow, in Minnesota, since we're close to North Dakota, those sorts of things. So that's all well and good, but now you might be saying, well, great, now I'm more confused. I mean, the idea of carelessness is easier than the average farmer. And if that's what you're experiencing, you are not alone. What does the average farmer do? Who is the average farmer? And how are we coming up with this information? Like, who puts out the survey asking cantaloupe growers, how do you irrigate? How do you harvest? Is there a manual? Do we go read the, cantaloupe harvesting guide that everybody reads? In many cases, no, we don't know what the average farmer does. We don't know where that guide is that tells us what we all do in this situation. With a definition like this, there is only one thing that we can be certain of, and that is that we will argue. So, cantaloupe makes someone sick. The injured person is going to be saying, oh my goodness, the farmer's food safety practices were much less robust than other farmers. Oh, they were so deficient. They did not do what your average farmer does. And here's my evidence. I have Farmer Joe who does this and this and that. And I've got Farmer Sue who does this. And I have this published report that says farmers do this. Well, now it's the farmer's turn on the stand. The farmer stands up and says, no. My food safety practices are just like every other farmer's. I am doing exactly what my neighbor does. I am doing what my friend does. I am doing what I heard at the conference that we do. So who's right? Did that specific farmer do what everybody else does? We don't know. We are only going to find out when a judge or a jury decides. And that is the job of the judge and the jury, is to decide if this person is liable based under the theory of negligence, based on their alignment with what everybody else does. And so they're like, which side do we believe? Which side has the better evidence? And all sorts of other extremely unpredictable stuff and things. So it's a rough spot to be in. This is a rough spot. How do we move forward? Because we don't want to dwell in that uncertainty. Farmers dwell in enough uncertainty. We got to get some footholds to stay positive. What can we do? I got some tidbits for you. Okay, the first thing you probably want to keep in mind is you need to keep pace with other farmers. You do kind of have to think about what other farmers do. And one of the ways that you can keep pace without putting out a survey and interviewing everybody is to comply with regulations. And I especially mean complying with regulations that are designed to protect the safety of the nation's food supply. And I am referring specifically to the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's a piece of federal legislation. It is a law that requires farmers to do things like test their irrigation water sources, to manage their employees in certain ways, provide specific training. And the Food Safety Modernization Act does have a number of exceptions for small farms. So if you are under a certain size and you market your product primarily locally, the federal government and state government's not going to come after you for failure to comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Some people call it FSMA for the acronym. So that's nice. That's a sigh of relief. But if you aren't complying with it, are you keeping pace with other farmers? Are you accidentally becoming more negligent because you are not doing what other folks do? So that risk is real, and strong risk management does suggest that you comply with the regulations that are written to protect our food supply, even if you don't technically have to. Because my next point is, do you really want to keep pace with other farmers, or do you want to be one step ahead? If you're doing more than everybody else, you're a little better protected. It's a little easier to show that you were not negligent. So, I mean, on the downside, you can see how this leads to a little bit of an arms race when it comes to food safety practices. Once we keep stepping up the ladder for improved practices, everybody's got to keep stepping up the ladder. If you don't, if you get left behind, you're going to look more negligent. Something bad happens. So that's why culturally we see ever increasing caution and labeling in our everyday lives as we go about our business. You know, more labels on products, and our car starts talking to us about our responsibility to drive well, and those sorts of things. That's because we're keeping ahead of negligence and making sure that we are doing better than the other guy. So it's something that you can actually see in your everyday life. So the other side of this, though, is that it's not quite enough to just keep pace with other farmers and maybe even do better than them. Because even if you are the safest farmer in the entire state, and you've got all the evidence to show why you're complying with every law, you still need to prove it. You can still be sued. Because if somebody gets sick from some cantaloupe somewhere, they want to find out who's responsible. How do we find out who's responsible? We sue them all. We sue them all, they all go into court. And they all say, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. Or, I know it happened on my farm, but look, I wasn't negligent. I did exactly what I was supposed to do. So you've got to be able to prove it, to show what your practices were, line them up against other farmers, get the data, get the evidence, and say it in a convincing way. That's what an attorney does. That's the role. That's the job of an attorney. That's why we go to law school, what we're here for. So our cantaloupe farmer, she needs to keep pace with other farmers, but really, she needs an attorney. Access to an attorney. I mean, maybe not right now, hopefully, and hopefully never, honestly, but she needs access to one and the ability to have one represent her if something does go wrong. Attorneys are expensive, probably not news to you, and especially going to be expensive at this point in time if something bad has happened and you are looking at controlling damage and trying to defend yourself. Does this mean you need to keep a spare 100,000 in the bank and go down to Main Street and start shopping around for an attorney? No, thankfully, no, it doesn't. What you need to do is get insurance coverage. Okay, so when most people think about insurance, they're thinking about the funds that cover the actual liability. They're thinking about the medical costs and the damages to the injured person. But really, insurance is much more than that. Your insurance company is likely to provide you with an attorney who will defend you. Now, why? Well, when you put the pieces together, you realize, well, geez, the insurance company is on the hook if you end up liable. If you end up liable, they got to pay out to that injured person. So they don't want that. They don't want you to be liable in the first place. So they're going to work hard in court to try and prove that you were not negligent and are not responsible for this injury. So when you think of insurance, don't just think of that limit of liability, that pot of money that's going to help make that person whole. Think of insurance like a retainer on an expert attorney, one who is ready and standing by to defend your practices if something bad happens. This is also why you might notice that some insurance companies have standards, rules about what types of farms or what types of farm practices they will or will not cover. And that's because they know that they have to defend those practices in court if something bad happens. You also may find insurance companies that will require you to do certain things or have certain practices in place in order to get coverage. And again, that's because they're the ones who have to stand up in court and defend what you're doing when something happens. So food safety insurance is also it's not just about the injured person. It can help you in covering your own costs after a food safety incident. So, if you end up like the Colorado cantaloupe farmers, you're going to need to recall some melons, lots of melons, maybe. You're going to have to pay for potentially very expensive cleaning and resetting of your equipment to ensure that the sneaky microbes aren't still hanging around waiting for another ride to the grocery store. That stuff costs a lot. And in the meantime, you're not earning revenue. You are, your reputation is suffering damage. There are different formulas of insurance that can help get you coverage for all of those additional costs that you would incur. So I don't sell insurance, I swear, I don't. I earn nothing if you go buy insurance. I am here to tell you what its legal role is and why it plays such a prominent role in business in America. It is because of the way the legal system is designed, the way negligence is assigned. That's why we have the kind of insurance system that we do and why this is such an important part of business life in America. Insurance is incredibly valuable. It's essential no matter how safe you are. So I'm going to spend the rest of our time together discussing food safety insurance and what to look for and watch out for in a policy, and how to find insurance coverage that will work for you. But before we get there, I want to recognize that you might be feeling a little deflated right now. As farmers, you're in this to produce great food for good people. You're good risk managers, and you do your best often when you can control risk and manage production and be successful that way. And we also know that many farmers are in it to build community. They want to establish connections with their community, with people that they know and trust, and feel good about growing food. So it can be a real downer to think that, oh man, the folks eating my food, they're gonna just sue me at the first chance? They're gonna try to put me out of business? So before we go too much further, I do want to shed a little bit of light on what is really going on here when a farm gets sued. It can be easy to slip into oh, people are so litigious these days. They're just so sue happy and like you can't trust anybody. It's not that everyone is out there suing the very moment that they get sick. It's not necessarily that we can't trust anyone to take responsibility or to accept the risks of eating a cantaloupe anymore. There's a little something else going on. And this might make you feel better, or it might make you feel worse. It is often not the injured person who is driving the lawsuit bus. It is actually their health insurance company. So treatment for a food safety illness can involve kidney damage, followed by a lifetime of dialysis or a kidney transplant. These involve enormous lifetime costs in medical care and prescription drugs to manage the fallout from some of our worst food safety illnesses. An insurance company, a private insurance company, is paying that more than likely, if it's not the federal government. So the insurance company would like to be paid back for those millions and millions of dollars that they are paying for that treatment. And if they can win a judgment against the farmer awarding them medical costs, they will do it. When we all buy private health insurance, we sign over the right to sue in our own names for injuries our health insurance company pays to treat. So the health insurance company is like, say an 8-year-old gets sick from drinking cow's milk. It's not the 8-year-old's decision. It's not the parent's decision. It's the health insurance company's decision about whether or not that farm is going to get sued for the treatment provided to that 8-year-old. So what this also means is that you're not going up against small town attorneys necessarily that are representing the Joneses who got injured. You're going up against the health insurance company's attorneys. And they will put their best folks forward to win this and recover their millions that they've paid. So you really need someone who has the expertise and the availability to help you out as soon as you need it. So again, insurance. You're in a really bad spot if you're shopping on Main Street for this attorney. And the best way to get good coverage is to really have an insurance company in place that's going to appoint someone timely, quickly, who's an expert, who is available. So that's why I focus so hard on insurance. Now, my job will be easy, and we could end this presentation now. If I'm just like, go get insurance, people. That's not quite that easy, especially when it comes to food safety. It can be hard to know for sure if you are covered for a food safety incident. This stuff is complex. That's why we got, 45 or 15 minutes left here for me to cover it before I get to your questions. So, you've probably heard this before. People have told you, your farmer's market has told you, you need to get insurance. So why do we all still have a pit in our stomach when we're thinking about insurance on our farm? Why are we wondering what's really going on? If that's happening to you, your instincts are good. It is really hard to know if you are doing things right and if you have the coverage for what you need. Why is it so hard? Farm Commons, we have definitely asked ourselves this, and we have done a lot of research to try to understand what's really going on out there. We read through hundreds of pages of insurance policies. We called people, we talked to underwriters, we talked to agents. And we have some really unfortunate news. In our research, we found that foodborne illness is rarely covered by common farm insurance policies, even if the policy title or name gives you the impression that you would be covered. And coverage for foodborne illness, that's what you need to be covered for, Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria. These things are pretty tricky to get good coverage for. So our goal is to always give you all the facts that we can and to be really upfront and straightforward as we can. So in my next slides, I'm going to outline some common coverage trends about food safety insurance and some of the complexities of understanding if you do or don't have coverage. Don't forget to get those questions in the chat box too. I am transitioning away from like the theoretical, how do I become liable, and moving more fully into the insurance at this point. But if you have questions about anything, in the courtroom, how do you become liable? Don't hesitate to get those in. So here are the coverage trends I'm going to be addressing. Number one, foreign object injury, generally covered. Excellent. Communicable disease injury, no, generally not covered. Be very careful of the virus and bacteria endorsement and the business exclusion. So this will be the makeup of our next 10, 12 minutes. Let's get into the details. Okay, so number one, foreign object injuries. This is our first coverage trend. Typical farm liability policies include coverage for the odd nail, nut and bolt, or other foreign object they can turn up. So, this is most inclined to happen in things like salad mixes, bagged spinach, and other crops where like loose items can get dropped in and lost, end up on a fork and go into someone's mouth. In all of the policies that Farm Commons has reviewed, injuries caused by foreign objects, basically anything that is not food, that's find its way into the food, that's covered. So most of us actually have some kind of experience with this, and it usually happens in a restaurant context. Maybe you have been out to eat and discovered glass shards in your glass of water, or maybe broken piece of plastic in a pancake or something like that. Now, when that happens, hopefully we see it and we pass it back to the waiter before we eat it. But when people don't notice and eat these things, it can be really bad. Pebbles and stones, which you're most likely to deal with in your salad mix, don't tend to be very dramatic. Those things, as most of us who have 3-year-olds or 2-year-olds know, they just pass right through and they don't cause a lot of harm. If it's glass or a battery or something like that, that can be extremely dangerous and can lead to further inquiry and lawsuits about who is responsible, because honestly, the cost of treating that can be really high. So these strange things do happen, and they usually are covered. So the insurance company would delegate an attorney who would gather the evidence that you did everything the average farmer does to keep foreign objects out of your spinach, like being careful when you harvest, covering harvest bins, and keeping your equipment in working order so that it's not spewing nuts and bolts everywhere that will fall into your food. Now, I'm an attorney, so I got to say, okay, yes, there are other avenues that you could end up to still be liable for a rock in your food, but focusing on negligence, you're probably covered, you probably have insurance. Let's talk about communicable diseases, trend number 2. Communicable disease is generally excluded from coverage. So you might be tempted to think foreign objects includes pathogens, and that has been argued in court, but no. They are not considered foreign objects. They are disease. So we might hope, we might want our Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria to be covered under this, but the exclusion of communicable disease is going to make that harder. Your typical exclusion in an insurance policy will sound something like bodily injury arising out of transmission of a communicable disease by an insured, you're the insured, is not covered. It's usually buried deep in the paperwork, page 38, you know, of 90. You got to hunt for it, but there it is. So what does this really mean? What is a communicable disease? Some of our most classic ones are like cold and flu. You get that from other people and we think of it as a disease. So, you know, as you probably suspected, you have no coverage if your apple gives someone the flu or because a worker came to work sick. Now, the reason that's not normally a problem is that no one sues you because they got the flu from your farm stand or a cold from a contaminated apple. Because honestly, most of us don't get that harmed by those things. But when you think about this communicable disease issue a little deeper, it can get tricky. You get sick from salmonella, right? So that makes it a disease? And isn't it communicable? Salmonella can be transferred to other people. Usually that's via fecal matter contamination from another person. So it can happen. And if salmonella is a communicable disease, then we don't have coverage. Good question. What we have to do is we have to start looking at what does communicable mean. So this is a dictionary, it's not a court of law. But if you look at the bottom, it says diseases that spread through vectors, not direct contact with another person, are not communicable. And you can get salmonella both ways, unfortunately. In my research, 96% of folks who get salmonella through food, which means through other vectors, other disease vectors that are not other people. But we still have 4% of people who get salmonella, which is clearly a disease, and was communicated from one person to another. So it could be a communicable disease. I'm leading towards the answer that I don't know if salmonella is a communicable disease. And why am I telling you this? Because this is an exclusion. If injury from communicable disease is not covered under most farm liability policies, then salmonella is not a communicable disease, then it is covered. I know it takes me time to wrap my head around it. If it's not a communicable disease, it is covered because communicable diseases are not covered. We don't know. That's the bottom line, is we don't know how Salmonella, E. coli would be read in court as whether it's covered or not. I told you we were going to tell you the truth about what we could figure out. And when we call the underwriters and say, yeah, so Salmonella, communicable disease, they say, well, I'm not going to comment on that. Well, I can't tell you if that is or isn't. Do you have a lawsuit in front of you? You know, you asking me to file a brief or a statement? Because if you don't have like a need to know, we aren't saying. But the plot thickens. It gets worse. Watch out for the dry rot bacteria virus exclusion. All right. So even if communicable disease does not mean foodborne illness, there's another exclusion that is going to knock foodborne illness out of the coverage ring. So tacked onto many of the policies that we see is something called this dry rot bacteria virus exclusion. And these exclusions state that coverage for this type of damage is included. Yay, sounds good. Except if they arise out of anything intended for bodily consumption. If they come from food. So I'm not sure how someone's getting injured from dry rot bacteria and virus for eating things that aren't food. But if that's what happens, you have coverage. If they get it from eating something that is food, you don't have coverage. All right, so these are the common trends. This is what we have seen in most of the insurance policies that we have looked at. If you want to go look for this yourself in your insurance documentation, you will find something like this. Insurance coverage under H and J, and those refer to the limits of liability. for all damages and reasonable medical expenses arising out of a fungi or bacteria incident is subject to the fungi and bacteria liability aggregate limit described in paragraph B, which may say, not for anything they ate that was food. So it's a maze. Getting into your policy language is a ridiculous maze of caveats, exemptions, definitions. So when you call up your insurance agent and you're hoping for a straight answer on, is E. coli in my spinach covered? Is Listeria on my cantaloupe covered? This is what they too are dealing with. And they're really getting into what attorneys do day in and day out. And it can be very challenging to sort these policies out. We've covered three trends: the foreign object, the communicable disease, and the bacterial for human consumption exclusion. And we have one more. Watch out for the business exclusion. A typical farm liability policy will not cover any business that isn't farming. And farming is not drying products, making jams, jellies, or pickles, or anything else that adds value. It may be perfectly legal for you to make dried foods, jams, jellies, and pickles in your home kitchen, but your insurance company is not covering you for the risks of that. They are not insuring those products under a farm liability policy. You will need to go to your insurance company and say, I'm making jam. If a loose screw falls in the jam, will you cover me? Then they'll say, yes, and we will sell you an additional policy to do that. And here's what it will cost. So what now? If this is concerning, you're not alone. This happens to farmers all the time and is, just a huge part of our work to educate folks on what insurance does and doesn't do. You do deserve answers. You're paying money for an insurance policy. You deserve to know what is and is not covered. And the best way to do that is to talk with your insurance agent. Talk with the person who sold it to you. Here are some things you really need to ask. Should I be aware of any food safety practices you require farms to adopt? I mean, ideally, they would tell you when they sold you it if you're required to do something, but it doesn't always happen. So ask that question specifically. Then we move through our specific trends we covered today. Am I covered for foreign objects? Am I covered for SEL, Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria contamination that might result from, and then be specific, contaminated irrigation water, equipment malfunction, and keep going depending on what your specific farm's risk exposure is, depending on what you grow and where you see those vectors as coming from. And then finally, do I need a business endorsement? Am I engaging in any value-added operations that are going to require a little something extra for me to get coverage? Now, of course, this is easier said than done. I can stand here and say, ask your insurance agent these things, but they may not know the answer. And they may not be able to provide it in writing such that you can rely on it. And of course, yes, the conversation might result in you being offered another insurance product, like a full product liability policy, which you may not be able to afford. So yeah, they might say, well, that's great, but that's another $1,000 a year if you want that. Despite that crushing reality that this might result in more bills and a higher premium and greater uncertainty for you, knowledge is still power. And you can still walk away from that conversation knowing where your risk exposure is. It is better to know than not to know. I really do believe that you can make subtle changes to your behavior once you know that you aren't insured, or that would be a farm ending incident if it happened. Better to know than not know. And of course, it goes without saying, but I will say it, prevention, prevention, prevention. Follow the procedures from the Produce Safety Rule of FSMA. Get GAP certification, even if you are not required to. And do your very best, of course, to prevent the cells from getting into your food in the first place. Farm Commons is not your source for how to keep that from happening. We aren't scientists, but we can tell you that you need that this is an extremely important risk management strategy, but don't go without insurance. You might be the safest kid on the block, you still need insurance. And last thing, consider forming an LLC or a corporation. If something awful does happen and you are sued and you have an LLC or corporation, you can at least protect your business assets. You may lose all of your business assets, but at least your personal ones will be protected. So I've got some specific questions that you all submitted before the program. I'm going to get to those next. Before I do, discovering resilience. If you really enjoyed learning this and you're like, geez, what else don't I know? We've got a class for you. You can take it on your own time, anytime at our website. We cover the 10 legal best practices of resilience. And this is not actually included in those 10 best practices. So this is just bonus material. Learn all new stuff. We have 100+ guides and models, tons of new information on insurance as well. It's not just food safety. We cover auto insurance, property insurance, all the things you need to know to be effective with these tools. We are a membership organization. If you want to join and get access to all of our stuff, 30% off with the code FARRMS30, which is good for almost a year. And now I'm going to cover a couple of specific questions before we open it up to more questions generally. And someone from North Dakota Department of Ag was a couple of resources to share. So some folks said, number one, what is your most often overlooked element of farm food safety? A little self-serving, but I'm going to go with insurance. Most often overlooked element of farm food safety is that ability to defend yourself in court if something goes wrong. Don't forget that part. Someone asked, what are the requirements for selling at farmers markets as a North Dakota producer? Again, you very much noticed that I did not go into state-specific or farmers market-specific rules. Our gal Angie might be able to help us out with that, but I want you to know, I want to reinforce from our program today that even if you're not required to do things, even if there are no rules, as there often are no rules for selling a raw agricultural product, you need to do what other producers are doing. Don't slip below the threshold of negligence. 2 or 3 folks asked about integrated animals and crop production. I'm going to paste a link into the chat box. We wrote a guide for the Savannah Institute out of Illinois, specifically on that topic. So you got 40 pages of reading ahead of you. And lastly, someone asked about plastic versus wood cutting boards. And I'm going to use that question as an excuse. If you are using a cutting board, we're talking about something else entirely. So what I'm talking about is farming and strictly farming only. And in farming only, you're allowed to do what's called a harvest cut. You're allowed to sever the lettuce from the ground to harvest it and to use a knife to do that without incurring specific food safety obligations. But once you make a second cut to that, then you may be in the realm of being a processor, and there you may need a food safe. You may need to do that in a licensed facility. And when you do that in a licensed facility, that is the time to discuss plastic versus wood cutting boards. So on a regular farm that does not engage in processing, cutting boards should not have a role because all cuts should be made in the field to harvest. So that's my point of saying you're transitioning into another realm of authority and a permit that's going to be required in order to be able to do that. So I'm going to hand it over to Angie for a little more state-specific information.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. That was really great information. So again, my name's Angie. I'm with the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. I am the new local foods marketing specialist. So I've been in this role for just a couple months now. So some of the safety trainings that we promote here from the Department of Ag are what you mentioned earlier, the Food Safety and Modernization Act, or what we call FSMA. They have a produce safety training, and it's not really required. There's unless you make your produce income is over $25,000 or $30,000. I think they recently changed it, but they have those exemptions listed on the website. However, we do recommend that all producers do be taking some of this training and learn those good practices and make a farm safety plan as well. So the other training we have is the Good Agricultural Practices, and that's called GAP. GAP is actually more of a buyer-driven one. So you might have like a restaurant or a facility that requires their farmers to have a GAP certification. Whereas FSMA is actually the federal law. So that does have to be followed if you fall into those requirements. So just a good clarification there to keep in mind. We do partner with NDSU Extension to offer these trainings throughout the year. So you would just want to Google and find out when they're coming up. I think we already had some for 2023, but I'm sure we'll get some on the calendar coming up soon. I know if you go to the FSMA website too, there's lots of national trainings you can take online for free. Some of them do charge money, some of them are free. So if you're needing to take it sooner than later, you can always check for that resource too. That's about all I have. Any other questions anyone has for me? All right. You can always check out our Department of Ag website too and our local food map. Check all that stuff out and contact us that way too if you ever do run into questions.
I have a slide to share with you all as well about some food safety resources available locally. So here in North Dakota, as Angie said, NDSU Extension has some food safety resources, and I have been putting these links in the chat box as well, so that you can get to them quickly. Extension's Field to Fork series covers all sorts of information about raising specialty crops and produce, including some food safety guidance. And then Dakota College at Bottineau, through their community education program, has a GAP course. That is the Good Agricultural Practices that Angie mentioned. And so I believe that is an online course. The cost is $99 to participate, and it's taught by Keith Knutson. Then there's also the North Central Food Safety Extension Network, which North Dakota is part of, and they have links to additional resources. So I know today's seminar was more about the legalities and the liability. We, FARRMS and Angie with Department of Ag and Extension can also direct you towards those resources and training for prevention, how to wash, how to wash, pack safely, how to process food safely. And your local health departments also have information about safe food handling practices. So if you have further questions about those things, which I saw a lot of questions in the registration, FARRMS is here to help. And Rachel added the link to the guide written and distributed by the Savannah Institute as well.
I might have one more thing to add, just as a heads up. Right now, I'm revising a document we have for Farm to School, which you could also call Farm to Institution. There are just a few different requirements as opposed to selling directly to a consumer. So we'll have that document revised fairly soon. And then I know that NDSU Extension is also updating their document, which has similar content on that. So those should be available too. Stephanie, we can send them to you if you want to disperse them, unless you already have them. But it's all be completed soon. Okay.
Yeah. And this webinar will be posted on our website, as well as it was live streamed to our Facebook page. So it will be visible from our Facebook page. And to both the Facebook page and the website, I will add these links so that you can find this information again. Were there any final questions? We've got about 2 minutes left. Anything you wanted to know about from Department of Ag or from Rachel? Thank you so much for this great presentation, Rachel. FARRMS has an institutional membership with Farm Commons, and we are so pleased to have that partnership and access to all these great resources that you have to offer. Thank you for joining us, Angie, and sharing what Department of Ag has for farmers as well. And thank you all for joining us today. And we hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks,
Thank
folks.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.